Welcome you all, and welcome to all our great speakers. I will say just a few words about the exhibition, and then we'll jump into the conversation. I had the honor of curating the exhibition Willem de Kooning, Endless Painting. This is the first exhibition of the gallery since 2013. As you heard from Cara, the exhibition spans 5 decades, from the 40s to the 80s, bringing together 24 artworks. And it highlights formal relationships and visual rhymes that are spanning across different periods, showcasing a constant process of artistic reinvention that animates de Kooning's oeuvre throughout the decades. De Kooning was an artist that really evaded easy categorizations. He lived a very long life, went through many different styles and chapters and periods in his practice, but in spite of the radical shifts that are often discussed in his work, he also maintained a profound engagement with the essence of painting itself, reinterrogating what a painting is and what a painting could be over and over. For this reason, the exhibition doesn't follow a chronological order, but instead highlights connections across different decades among seemingly disparate paintings, highlighting recursive methodologies and visual motifs that recur throughout his oeuvre. Today we have a very exciting conversation ahead of us. We'll touch upon this artist's relationship with de Kooning. We'll talk about the figure, and in particular the flesh, as a site of experimentation. We'll discuss your and de Kooning's engagement with art history, but also pop culture, and also analyze some of the technical aspects of yours and de Kooning's practice. So I want to start with the same question to all of you, which is a bit of an introductory question about your relationship with de Kooning. And Dana, I will start with you. How has de Kooning been an influence in your practice? And do you recall the first time you saw a painting in person by de Kooning?
Yes. So de Kooning has been an influence. I think it just throughout the years in terms of his process, like the paintings always feel like they're kind of on the way to something, and then they're caught in a moment. And as a painter, it's always a good reminder, because when you're painting, sometimes it's not going well, and you can think, well, there's always something coming, and his paintings really do that. So I feel like they're influential in that way, but I think the main thing is that they're very confrontational, especially the woman paintings. Like they feel alive, and they feel like they're like so much at painting, like there's so much going on in the pictorial space and interior of the painting, but they always kind of look back at you, and it's almost like you encounter them instead of viewing them. Some of them, like the women paintings especially, and they feel kind of like a wild animal, like in the room. And I think that's just incredible. But the first time I ever saw a de Kooning painting, I was 16 years old, and it was Merritt Parkway. But it was in the Detroit Institute of Art, and I was with my mom and dad, and I think we were looking at art schools or something. And I remember my dad pointed to this painting and said, "Oh, this is a de Kooning. I like de Kooning." And I thought, I think I like de Kooning too. And then, but my mother went to art school in the 60s. In Michigan, and at that time they were teaching de Kooning. This was being taught in art school, so they were all trying to make these painterly paintings, but they would be of like Lake Michigan. So our house was just filled with these splashy paintings of Lake Michigan, and but I remember the thing about the de Kooning painting that was really jarring was that it was so Merritt Parkway is like, it feels landscapey. There's this patch of blue, and there's a hint of a horizon, but there's this giant white, kind of violent interruption that's vertical in going through the horizon down the middle of the painting, and it feels like there's no ground to stand on, and it feels really dislocating. And I think at the time, I thought that it felt not familiar, like it felt like the city. I thought, like, oh, this feels like New York City. And I think at that time I wanted to go to New York City, or I was thinking about becoming an artist, and I thought, well, this feels like a place I want to go. Like, I want to get out of Michigan, get out of Lake Michigan. I want to go to New York and make these paintings. So, yeah, it was exciting.
And John, what about you? What does the Kooning work mean to you?
Well,
it's a big question, but
he was kind of my first. I mean, in high school, I didn't really know about much about modern art, and I did, however, like, you know, album cover art and that kind of thing, and then he was sort of my first love in art school, and then I made fake de Koonings for all through grad school, and
were they good?
No, I mean they were okay, I guess, but you know, it's a long tradition of making fake de Koonings. You know, like a lot of different artists, good artists, made fake de Koonings, and I mean, I think it was my way of, I guess, understanding maybe Picasso and modernism in general. You know, and although I will say that for me, they always retain the kind of, you know, excitement of looking at a Frank Frazetta painting, or like an album, you know, an album cover or something. You know, they're high art, but they feel even more exciting than that sometimes, and they kind of awaken the teenager in me still.
Do you still look at them the same way?
No, I always liked the drier ones. You know, the drier, the 50s, with dry white paint. But I gotta say, the one on paper, I forget what it's called.
Montauk 2?
1969. Yeah. It's just this flabby, fucking like just blobby thing. It's just amazing, and I never liked those. Those were always my least favorite. These kind of drunken Hamptons paintings. But I gotta say, I'm looking at them very differently now. And anyway, he's always been my kind of idea. I always felt like he's the one who shows an American how to look at European painting in a lot of ways.
That's very interesting. And Jenny?
I think it's the dexterity of what he does, really. You know, if you work in oil paint, his vocabulary is wider than anyone else, and it has just taught me a lot. You know, he's taught me about reversing a brush, sizes of brushes, consistency of paint, which is really, really key to his work, is the way he uses consistency. And I think it's that dexterity. If you like painterly painting, like Soutine, that kind of painting, then he just offers. They're just so visually exciting. You know, not all paintings are better from reproduction to when you go and see them in the flesh, and they're just so exciting. Like only a few artists really like get me going. Like when I encounter them visually in front of the painting, and I just want to be in my studio and I see something and I just think, oh, that's so good. You know, it just makes me want to paint. It's just a very exciting. I like all the periods of him for different reasons. And actually this show, the main thing of this show for me is the structural element that goes through all of the work, that you see the kind of skeleton of what he was doing, the rhythms and the shapes go from the abstract paintings to the very sensual ones with paint. And I think he is that bridge between Europe and America. He has that European tradition and his training coming to America, and he used paint in every way, from a stain to a drip to scraping it down. You travel so well with his work. That's around the surface of the canvas.
And has your kind of perception of his work changed since the first time you approached his work?
Well, I saw Woman One as a reproduction. We don't have a lot in the UK.
Sure.
We only have like The Visit, I think, at Tate. I think that's probably, and that's never out very often. So I'd never really seen them in the flesh until I came to America. And it was a shock. I saw a reproduction and I just thought, what is that? You know,
Do you remember what it was?
It was Woman One.
It was Woman One.
And it was just, I just couldn't understand how you made something like that. Like I was completely drawn to it, but at the same time, how do you articulate that? How did you do that? You know, and I felt very removed from it in that I didn't know how to make something like that.
Sure.
But I was really attracted to it, and so, you know, when I came to America, I saw Easter Monday at the Met and Woman One at MoMA, and it was literally a physical effect. I felt my neck going back. You know, I had a physical experience of, you know, that this was this paint on a surface that was just so exciting. You know.
John, back to you. I want to talk about flesh. De Kooning famously said in a lecture about the Renaissance period, and I'm going to quote, "Flesh was very important to a painter then. Both the state and the church recognized it. The interest in the difference of textures between silk, wood, velvet, glass, marble was there only in relation to flesh. Flesh was the reason oil paint was invented." And of course, de Kooning was incredibly influenced by the work of old masters like Rubens and Titian and Veronese, who revered the sort of carnal sensuality of the body and the flesh. And I know that your work also carries historical ties to painters like Parmigianino, for instance. So I'm just curious to hear you talk about those influences on your work, and if you want to reflect also on...
I mean, one thing that he says oil paint was invented to make flesh, and then so it occurs to me that, you know, you think about Mantegna or the Italian painters, Botticelli, you know, who paint in tempera, and, you know, you take the clothes off, like the drapery is a sculpture. You take the drapery off, and there's another sculpture underneath, like the body is a sculpture. In northern painting, Flemish painting, you take the sculpture of the drapery off, and you have like a naked sinner. You know, you have like a naked, you know, ashamed naked person, and or in the case of Rubens, you have like, you know, somebody about to have sex, or, you know, you know, naked but exciting and sexual, and not like a Greek, you know, sculpture, not ideal. And I think there's a northern sensibility in that sense in de Kooning's paintings, not just the representation of like the drawing of figures, but I mean like the presence of paint, the thick paint, like I was saying, the droopy paint. There's a kind of a, you know, the paint is a kind of sinner's body and is a kind of mortal, and you know, it's not like a Saint Sebastian looking hot and perfect, you know, with arrows going out of him by Mantegna or by an Italian. It's you know, a flabby sexual presence. Even the abstract paintings. Maybe these don't really do that, but I mean, so I think that is paradoxically, I think that's a northern Christian attitude toward the body that results in a much more sexual presence.
Is that something that you share in your own practice?
I mean, I think ultimately when I, you know, think about bodies and my flesh and sex, it's both. You know, I'm not Christian, but it's a Christian sensibility, I think, and it's exciting because it's guilty, and it's you know, my parents won't approve, you know, that kind of thing, and so I think there is a naughtiness, I guess, childish naughtiness that I can't shake. You know, 62-year-old man being childish is kind of pitiful, but you know, that's the northern alternative convention, as Kenneth Clark would say, is where I see my work.
Sure.
And I more and more see de Kooning in that tradition as well.
And Jenny, now to you, if you also want to elaborate a bit on the idea of the flesh, both in de Kooning and in your own work, which of course, where the rendition of skin and flesh is incredibly important through different technical devices and showcasing also imperfections and vulnerabilities. But we were also looking in the other room at paintings like Montauk 2, Landscape of an Armchair, and we have also a great example here in terms of Boudoir, which is 1972. So I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about flesh in de Kooning and in your work.
I think one of the things that marks him out is, as a figurative painter, you sort of learn like the flesh of the figure and then what's called kind of traditionally negative space. And he gave flesh to negative space. So the body kind of almost folds out. You're not quite sure where the boundary of the body is. And I found that incredibly exciting, where he, the way he works wet in wet, and he slides. Usually he'll lay down like a sort of so-called pure color in that it's come straight from the tube, or it's, like I say, it's alizarin crimson or cobalt or something like that. And then he'll ride a lighter color through that. And that the way that he does that creates multiple other tones, and those tones give a level of form. And I found that like a really exciting way to paint either a portrait or a body, that you could get to that transition of space or shape or form or building, not through a kind of structural sense of flats, like tonal flats that were opaque, sure, but by actually running colors together. And that was critical in my development.
And as a painter, how much is that a process that you can control versus kind of the result of lots of attempts and also chance?
Well, but that's the magic, right? I mean, when you run a color, or like he does a lot of it on the floor or the drips, the paint is forever frozen in this moment of becoming. And so it's like he's able to trap time. And I found that that's just really marks him out, Lots of, all painting sort of does that, but he heightens that reality. And that's it's a very poetic space,
And I think you have visited the studio in the Springs, right?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to spend several hours there, and it was.
Tell us about it.
It was more important than going to art school, without a doubt. It was.
This is the Kooning studio in the Springs in East Hampton, where he moved in the early '60s.
So I just, I must have been about, I don't know, my 20s, late 20s.
Oh wow!
And I walked into this space, this light-filled space that was built specifically for painting. It was the level of professionalism. It was, I was at the beginning of this arc of a career, or whatever you call it, in terms of development as a painter, and I got to see what he'd done in terms of, just look like tangible things, like the way he used a palette. Like at that time I was using like a metal palette or a piece of glass that wasn't that big. He had these vast tables on wheels, and he, like the types of brushes, the length of the brush, the length of the bristles, the long brushes. He had these color mixing cards. He had Pyrex bowls. I got to see that level of professionalism, and I just devoured that day. And it was like 10 years of development in one day. Like, and I went back to my studio. From that moment on, I worked with 2 palettes, 2 long glass table palettes that were very big, because he kept his environment clean, so the activity was in the painting. And it was just it was thrilling to see.
Why the 2 palettes? Why the 2 tables? Because
he had a palette each side of him.
Yeah.
So when he would be back, he could work on both sides, or he had these long tables. So it was a way that, on a smaller palette, I would make a mess quite quickly, and then you've got to clear that off.
Is it blues on one side and browns on one side, on the other? Or?
In my palette, I have like a range of colors that go across both palettes, but I use these long glass palettes, which keeps. I like them to be really clean, right? So it means that when I'm painting, I can keep painting for longer than I did before, because I had to clean the palette. So it just means you can sort of stay in this playful game for a long time.
That's great. Then have you ever been to the Kooning studio?
It would be amazing.
I'm sure we have the right people in the room.
You got out of Michigan.
I gotta know.
But I want to ask you also to expand a little bit on something that Jenny just mentioned, the idea that the Kooning painted often wet on wet. And I know we were talking just before the talk started about how important this is the process for you, and the idea also of building layers and layers on top of it as a way of constructing the painterly composition. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually tried to do that, like use safflower oil and with the newspaper a long time ago, and it did not work. It just dried to the canvas, and it was horrible. But I think that I was like, what is this about? Like,
why don't you walk us through exactly what it means?
Well,
wet on wet.
Okay.
All of you.
Okay. But I usually, when I start a painting, I'll coat it. Wet on wet is when the canvas is totally wet and with paint or oil or turpentine, and then there's very little friction, like when you're painting, so you can move really rapidly. And also, because it's wet, the brush strokes the edges can be very soft sometimes, and sort of enter into the space or atmosphere of the ground. And then you can also paint, depending on how you load the brush, you can make something very crisp on top. So it feels like there's this freedom in that space, and everything is sort of malleable, like you can move things around and block in shapes, and if it's not working, you can mush it out, and colors can mix in the painting and like within the wet ground, and you can get atmosphere. And so it's a great, usually I'll start that way, and before I start painting, I'll mix up a ton of paint so I don't have to stop. And it's nice that having that, the distance between thinking and painting is very short or very immediate. So there's no distance between thinking and painting, you're just painting. So I think that, so usually I'll paint in like bouts, like it'll be like, I'll paint this whole ground, and then if I want to go back into it and it'll dry, then I'll maybe resurface another area and then paint into that. And it's not all wet into wet, but I mean, it's a good way to have atmosphere.
And John, have you ever painted wet on wet?
Yeah, this morning. I mean, yeah, I mean, well, I mean, all painting is wet and wet in some sense, and I was telling you the story, you know, I was holding, I was holding, as it happens, I was holding a Van Eyck in my hands, and you know, as one does.
Of course, and, every morning.
But it was the Van Eyck Crucifixion at the Met, okay. and it was out of its frame, and I had it in my hands, and this crazy revelation of seeing that it was mostly painted directly, wet and wet, like that little gold shield in the middle of the painting is done with like yellow, orange, just kind of blended together like it's a Monet painting, and. So I mean, all you know, even paintings that seem to have been laboriously layered and prepared, you know, colors that get another. You make a green by putting yellow first and doing something over it. No, I mean, generally, the better the artist, the more direct and wet it is. So,
is there?
I aspire to always be painting wet and wet. You know.
Is there like a specific skill that the Kooning mastered that you admire very much? In terms of technical aspect?
I think Jenny was bringing this up. There is something about the use of a different viscosity of white, especially in the 50s, like that one over there, or the little green one and woman in there, where there's a kind of it's building form, but it's also a sort of slashing, like, it's hard to explain. I mean, I've seen it a million times in de Kooning, and I still can't quite understand what's happening, whether it's a form building thing or a you know, a guitar solo or a temper tantrum, or, you know, and it's all those things. But there is it's very specific to de Kooning that the viscosity, the difference in viscosity between what's going on and what's underneath is kind of perfect. And he would press newspaper into the paintings in order to change the viscosity of the underlying still wet layer, but to make it like waxier, so that that white will dig a little bit as it goes on. But, you know, and it's just sort of silly to talk about him doing it like it's some, you know, high technique, but it is. And really, he's kind of the only one. I mean, speaking as someone who tried to imitate it, it's hard to do, and it's one of those things where it's not just that de Kooning's good at it, although he is. There's something personal to it, which makes it his. And I think that's true of a lot of artists who do something magic. It's not that they're so good at that thing. It's that it has some other place in maybe in their childhood or in their, you know, that it's the only way they can paint.
And Johnny, yesterday when we were looking at the show together, you paused in front of Montauk 2 from 1969, which is on view in the other room, and you were talking about the difference between painting on canvas and on paper. Right. So just to continue talking about the fluidity of the paint and, you know, the artistic gesture and how your hand moves in a very different way.
Yeah, and I think it's the hardness of the surface, because you can work on a harder surface. And you can make the brush slide on that kind of paper. I mean, one of the things that I really like, that I kind of stole basically of what he does, is the way that he pushes. You know, if you have a big brush this size and you go either into white, or you put like a purer color down first and then the white, is that you can, instead of using a brush this way, he used a brush this way. So you push the brush into the paint. And when you use a brush like this size that has quite like individual bristles, so that they come apart a little bit, and you've got that in a bowl and it's the right consistency, and you push it, it kind of splashes, but it holds the tone. So you get this very beautiful kind of. Sometimes it mixes and sometimes it stays pure, and so you heighten that moment of movement, and it's the consistency of the paint that's really important, because if you get it too oily, or you get too much terps in it and too much oil together, then the two tones don't work properly. So when it's wet on wet, you have to get them at the right movement, otherwise because it can be turgid and not move properly. So you have to have the right slide. So the paper helps. But also if you look, that sometimes they're not as thick as you are, that you presume they are, because the reason why he used the kitchen paper or scraped it down is it creates another flat surface. And if you go to his pastels and you see how he rubbed down a lot, it gave him a flat surface that he could go again. So he creates these possibilities of going again at the canvas, and so that creates. It sort of pushes what was there before back as a previous layer that he can then add to on top, and it makes that level flat. I mean, he's got different techniques. He will work on paper. He might sand the surface, and if he just worked very thick all the time, you can't slide the brush. It becomes kind of dogmatic. The painting becomes dogmatic.
Do you think he worked on paper horizontally on a table or on a?
I think he's on both. I think it was. I mean, if you look at studio pictures, there are bits of paper all over the floor, and then he rotates them. Sure. And I think he was doing that all the way through. If you look at the collages that he made, where he starts with black enamel drawing, and he has paper clips. You know, like paper, not staples, but you know, thumb tap. And he'll rotate those. And so the orientation's been there for a long time, if you look at the sort of trajectory of the work.
And he also famously used different methods to kind of migrate shapes or transfer shapes that he liked.
And it worked on the floor. I mean,
with vellums or with newspaper pull-offs or with other means. Is that something that resonates with your practice? Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think working on the floor became very important that I learned from him, or just because when it's on the floor, you make a different kind of mark.
Sure.
So you have a gravity that's very different from having it upright on an easel or on tins or whatever. And I think that was a big influence on me, because you make a sort of different twist with your wrist than you make when it's upright.
I think I want to add, you made a very good point, and it's really important with de Kooning, is he almost invented this kind of plowing of the plowing, which I use, and it destroys the brush, number one, but it does this. It's anti-lyrical. It's you can imagine, especially a lot of bad imitations of de Kooning, it becomes a kind of a lyrical, like person water skiing, kind of brush strokes. And you'll notice in every single one of these, there's this like pushing back, like destroying what you just did.
He's got a kind of whip with his wrist.
Well, there's that side whip thing, but then there's just the plowing, like smashing your brush forward, and kind of digging up down into the waxy layers.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of how these so-called ugly parts come, that are actually the center of kind of violence in the painting. And anyway, you isolated it, and I realized that's a huge part of de Kooning, especially in the 50s.
Yeah. I want to jump to another topic and ask you, John, about your sources. Of course, you're looking at old master portraits and paintings, but also contemporary images of pin-ups, pornography, B-movies, and comics. De Kooning was also trained as a commercial artist early on in his career in Rotterdam, and of course was drawn to art history, but also to the contemporary visual explosion of images that surrounded him, on advertising, on magazines, on billboards. He also loved cartoons and caricatures. So I would love to hear you talk about the sort of clash between high and low culture, both in his work and your work.
I mean, I think being American, you already are born into that sort of conundrum, and even before you learn that, like, the pop artists made it explicit, and I guess de Kooning made it explicit with the cut, the grin that's cut out of a magazine, that kind of thing. There's a great anecdote about him, that when he first was a stowaway and came to I guess, I heard the story that he was in Hoboken, but it doesn't matter. He went to a coffee shop at 6 in the morning, and the guy was getting the coffee ready. He puts like 20 cups in a row, and it just goes like boom, and pours all the coffee. You imagine coming from Holland, like, I remember the first time I went to Europe, you get the coffee, and I remember, like, first of all, it's a laborious thing to make the coffee, and then I noticed, like, the men would be like leaning on the counter, and I would try to like lean the same way, and I absolutely couldn't do it, and like really couldn't, and he said, I knew I was in the right country when I saw the guy pour the coffee that way, I think it's maybe more of a not so much popular culture as a farewell to European culture.
Dana, I want to ask you about like a continuation of what we were talking about before in terms of violence. Your work seems to kind of hover between abstraction and figuration. You've spoken about being drawn to the Cobra movement, to someone like Kandinsky, who embraced a form of intuitive abstraction. But also your work is very much populated by creatures and figures that are distorted, mutilated, dismembered. So how do you balance the idea of like a sense of playfulness and humor with a sense of violence?
It's interesting because it depends on the subject, but I typically it's that you never really set out to make a painting. Like I don't think of it that way when I'm painting. It depends, but I think that if for something to be either violent or humorous, it tends to be a surprise to the maker, I think, you know, when you're making the painting, because it comes out of this rupture in the logic of the painting that you can't really predict. Like if you try to make something funny, it's not funny.
It's not going to work.
It's horrible. Or if you know, and with the paintings of a lot of the earlier subjects were almost things that were subjects of painting, you know, like things that could be, you know, remake themselves. And so I thought of them as more plastic than necessarily subject matter-wise violent. But I think that there can be, like in a gesture, you can have a kind of defacement, or it can hit in a certain way, or something can, like I just made a painting recently, and the figure in it, the face was so off kilter, and the girl in it looked really dopey, like after I made it, and I sort of laughed in the studio, and I thought, well, maybe should I get rid of her in the painting? Like, is she ruining the painting? She's like just too dopey. But I kind of didn't, I kept her because I thought, well, there's something actually interesting in that energy where you actually are surprised by the painting, and she had something very unexpected that happened. But it's interesting, it's hard to find a painting that's actually funny. Like I think, John, your paintings are actually truly, some of them, like hilarious, like really funny. But I think it's kind of like this, it's almost like a sweater where you pull a thread and the whole thing starts to unravel. Like you notice one element that's off, and then all of a sudden the whole painting goes off kilter. And I don't know.
That's all that happens to me now. Is like staying in the casino till 4 in the morning, like putting the same damn silver dollar in the slot machine over and over again. But I think actually you said something nice about what you were saying about like letting it dry is a big decision, right? You know?
Right.
And you said something about de Kooning, like stopping time or preserving time,
yeah.
or freezing time. You know, and there's this idea of it being like a clock or something. You know, it's like something that stopped when the plane crashed or something like that. And there's an aspect of comedy to that as well, of tragedy and comedy to just letting the mistake dry.
Right. Sometimes it's a hard thing to accept. Like if you're going to keep it.
Yeah.
Like I don't know. Yeah.
And sometimes it's, I used to share a studio with Sean Landers and for years, and I think we both helped each other. We'd walk in and say, walk away right now,
Yeah.
step away from the car,
Right.
kind of thing, and just let it be, whatever it is, let it be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard.
And especially before cell phones, where you could
Right.
fucking do every single stage of your painting and everything like that. It was very important sometimes to let things dry.
Right. I always loved it. I remember when one time you mentioned that with Sean, it was like kind of like a primary audience, that it would, if you made a painting that
Yeah.
he made him laugh. Yeah.
But we also sang for each other a lot of times.
Okay, that's really great.
Jenny, do you want to expand maybe on the notion of violence, looking at his paintings, and both in terms of content? Sometimes some of his paintings have been controversial or read as very aggressive, but also in terms of techniques that he used, with lots of knives and like an aggressive gesture on the actual canvas.
Yeah, I mean, I find all that a bit of a myth, really, in terms of just because you kind of go at a canvas does not mean you want to commit violence to the person that you're painting.
Of course,
it just doesn't work like that. And it's a when you're in the process of doing that, even if you're like scraping something off, it's like trying to find. It's like a playful game.
Sure. And
sometimes that might look like a violent gesture. I mean, that notion with that's lingered for so many years about Woman One, about the whole women series, that there's a sort of a misogynistic attack on women. I felt, when I saw them, I felt the complete opposite of that. I found these women active. They were not passive women. They were full of life. They were you could say fearsome, or, I mean, I didn't actually know that he saw them as self-portraits. I didn't look at them like that. But they're visually exciting. They've got life in them. As human beings, they've got a lot of life. So when it's a so-called violent mark, I didn't read them as violent. It's something that kind of annoys me about seeing painting like that. That violence it makes him seem like he wanted to commit violence to women. I just never made that connection. I just found them. Even like the neurotic twisted fingers in Woman One. He was trying to find a language, a shorthand to describe something.
Yeah. It's interesting because he also said that these were not necessarily portraits of a specific woman, but they were either self-portraits or types
a universal
or woman.
Idol, really, isn't it?
But he said something interesting about how, instead of trying to render the body as it was seen, he rendered it as it was felt. And it sort of reminded me a bit of what Maria Lasnik said in terms of the body awareness painting. So a mouth is never just two lips and a hole, but it becomes this focal point in the painting that is about nourishment, it's about sex, it's about joy, it's about so many other things.
Right.
So in a way it's what...
But all his vocabulary is like that. So, that's why I think if you look at the artists that are influenced by him, it's a whole range of artists. That's what makes him so important. Because you can be like a tighter figurative painter, you can be a completely abstract painter, and you still find something that's very fundamental to your practice as a painter. And I think that when you have a drip, or you have a scraped area, or a stained area that he's left, and then have something very sensual next to it, like a mark this big that has this sort of sensual shape. And because you see the presence of the making, like the brush going through the wet paint, for example, you feel the touch. And that absolutely relates you to the touch of another human being. That's why they're kind of sexy, because they feel like touch. And I think that he just took that he pushed that as far as he could, really.
And John, do you think the controversy around this series of work, especially Woman, is justifiable? Or how do you think about
I never understood I never, we were talking about this last night, and like, well, who exactly was it that was so upset about, and it turns out to be Clement Greenberg and the losers that hung around with him. And they just like, Clement isn't going to be the boss of Bill de Kooning, and because it always seemed like they were shocked that he would, come on, I kind of don't, in a way I put that in the same category as when, Rite of Spring was first performed,
Sure.
It was a riot in the theater. I don't think so. I think some guy took his walking stick and slapped something and walked out, and that was it, So, but I'm not making fun of the question.
I'm not controversial, right?
I'm not ridiculing your question. I just mean I wonder how deep that controversy actually was, and whether it's more a retroactive thing where a controversy is sort of imagined to have happened because the paintings are really good, or because they're surprising. And de Kooning to me would be the last person to really either positively or negatively respond to contemporary influences. So, I mean,
it's the playfulness, right? He I think he just didn't overthink it. He just, what if I do this? What if, and it's like, I like basketball, and I like to watch. If you see somebody moving a basketball and their wrist turns around and goes up to the basket, there's this poetic physical movement, and he uses a brush just like that. Sure. So there's this very, he gives you that beautiful kind of, I mean, he uses shapes like this, the way he makes these kind of handles, and that helps your eye travel. Yeah, he uses it all the way through especially once he gets, the mid-70s paintings. And he often uses an area activity to the bottom right of the canvas with areas that are completely just stained. And so it heightens the difference between the two. You see the contradiction of a very flat area with this very sensual shape. And those movements, just a movement like this or a twist where he kind of twists round with his brush, that acts like the twist of a knee. Or it operates in the same way, and I think our kind of collective memory taps into that. If you see a drip, it makes you think of other drips. All of those things bring in the forces of nature into his work.
And Dana, do you want?
Well, I was just going to say that that always seemed to me like, I agree with Jenny about and John, like the idea of the controversy around those paintings. They never felt to me like they were somehow attacking the woman or something. Like the painting is the woman and the woman is the painting, and it feels almost like the painting is a monster in a great way.
That would be a controversy that would happen now. The kind of stupidity that would take.
But didn't it happen in the
now would
no, but
about
in the
it being
80s.
a woman. I think back then it was about it being going against the conundrum of man, or some bullshit from French, from Sartre or something like that.
Well, I always think it always seems strange to me when people have this idea of this sort of stable self of the painter. Like when someone's painting, that you're somehow so yourself is so stable while you're painting, because so much of it you're embodied, but you're disembodied, and I think that you're responding, and the thing is becoming like a real living kind of thing. And I think with these, they feel very not passive, like they look back at you, they feel like goddesses and fierce and all these things, but I don't know, I always kind of thought it was strange that people would put so much on him as the painter, and that these are these angry marks or something,
But do you think they would have been received differently if they were made by a woman?
Probably, yeah, right. But
John, what do you think?
If they were made by a woman? I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to imagine that now. It's like saying, yeah, if Alice Neal's paintings were made by a man, it would be different, and if Artemisia's paintings were made by a man, but I mean, I think to get back to the so-called controversy of making paintings, I think maybe he was also trying to, he'd become, the biggest painter in the world, and abstract expressionism had triumphed as a style. With people like Greenberg then codifying it and making rules and everything like that. And I think it was just a way to maybe remind himself as well the much more primitive basis for the so-called principles of abstract expressionism. It's not abstract expressionism, it's painting, it's de Kooning's painting.
Sure.
So, I mean, no, I can't imagine them made by a woman, because I don't think the relation, if it became a revelation that de Kooning was actually a woman. I'd say, like, well,
We're gonna stop there.
you know, like that awful Pope movie, you know, like, you know, oh, he's
Don't
trans.
believe the end of the movie.
But you know, perhaps there'd be a crying game thing at the end of this. But I personally can't imagine them. I can't imagine de Kooning. It's not so much that I can definitely imagine a woman making these paintings, but I can't imagine de Kooning being a woman, I guess. and I can't imagine these made by, I guess what I really mean is, trying not to joke too much, is like, one thing I've learned getting older is that there's principles to paintings like de Kooning's or Warhol or Picasso, but really the most important thing is that they are the person that they are, you know. And so like when people talk about, like for instance, when people talk about Duchamp and they talk about the large glass and will the bachelors stand for this and the blah blah blah. I think it was Richard Hamilton did a whole thing about it, you know, how to interpret it. And you realize, no, it's just being Duchamp. It's like his weird personality, his weird obsessions. Just like Warhol to me is not pop art or like it's Warholism. It's the stuff that Andy liked. You know, he likes to have other guys do a screen print and then he can look at it with them and then and I think de Kooning is, you know, likes to do that plowing brush, and then he likes to do this, and he likes to have a cigarette the whole time, and he likes to make, you know, they kind of look like self-portraits to me sometimes too. The sharp edges on the mouth and everything, they kind of all look like those photographs of de Kooning, you know.
I think as well, this like living in the presence. That's what you get from him. You get a heightened sense of living in that presence, and the women paintings tap into that ancient fertility site. You know, so I know that he referenced Sumerian figurines, but also, you know, I've read that he was going around the Met and seeing all those sort of fertility sculptures that might have been in ancient grain stacks or something like that. And that fertility, the potency of that, I think, is in all of those women.
Sure.
And he takes something that's deeply ancient and combines it with, you know, cutting-edge avant-garde American painting. So that all of that time goes together. And I think he was brave, you know. I mean, he'd done the black and white paintings. Everyone was hailing him as this great hero. And he went in and you know, it's a thrilling ride. If you read the Mark Stevens book, it's an Annabelle Swan, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. You read that book, it's a thrilling ride, the Woman One journey.
Sure.
You know, where and you think that must have been quite difficult. You know, you'd been celebrated so much to make these abstract paintings.
Switch completely.
You know the great critics of the day loved what you did, but deep within him, and that served him well all his life, I think, to move in between these zones, between figuration, abstraction, landscape, and it gave him freedom of movement.
And as you mentioned landscape, I want to ask you all the relation, like one of the things that he said he was struggling very much with was trying to reconcile the figure and the background, or the foreground and the background. And we have two examples in the show, of course, Woman as Landscape, 1954, and also in the last room of the show, Woman in a Garden from 1971. And so I just want to hear you reflect on the relationship between the figure and the background, the surrounding, the landscape, and how you think he successfully reconciled those.
I think if you look at the woman painting here with the more sort of traditional woman painting, if you look at the top right-hand corner, there's an obvious like sky section and green, which is obviously the grass. And that relates deeply to Renaissance paintings when you have the figure and behind there might be a village, and you're aware of this landscape behind the flesh of the figure. And then as he gets more abstract in its figure and landscape, he uses just space, which is a sort of deactivated surface, or not deactivated, he just hasn't activated that surface, or it might have a bit of drawing or a stain. And that acts as exactly this, it does exactly the same role, but it's in an abstract form. And you take that landscape feeling, because that's deep within all of us, when you see that interplay of whether it's two colors or whether it's a horizon line, that's deep within our DNA, that we know that those things between the sky area and the horizon line and the ground. And he just uses that in corners, or especially in corners, but sometimes in sections near the edges.
And is that the same? Do you read the 1980s paintings, for instance, the one behind us, in the same way, where like a white background dialogues with this line?
Yeah, I think the older I've got, the more appreciation I've had of the. I didn't understand those paintings when I was younger. I would, you know, I've talked about it before. I was so interested in putting things into a painting. I didn't know how good it could be to take them out, you know, or to. And they're much more complicated than you think, you know, and white becomes, you know, is that negative or positive space? I mean, that's one of the key things about de Kooning, that he plays with what's form, what's space, or the interplay of those journeys around a canvas. And as I've got older, I really appreciate them much more.
And John and Dana, about figure?
I always felt, I mean, like you, I always preferred the you know, but it occurred to me that if I had to imitate anything here, these would be, I think these would be the hardest
right?
to copy. You know what I mean? Like I don't know how they're made, and they have those weird, you know, the orange brush stroke that's following the blue one on the left there. It's picking up somehow. I don't know how wet the paint was. I have no idea how he made it, and.
He kind of nudges the white in, and it picks up a little bit of the.
Yeah.
If he draws with red underneath, and he takes white into it, he uses. You can see just the edge of the brush picks up. Say it's cadmium red light or something. It picks that up as he's riding the white. But I'm never always sure whether the stronger color. Sometimes you think, okay, the whites come second, the whites afterwards, and then. You know, if you take that one, that's a really good bridge between the 80, is it 82?
82.
Yeah, it's a bridge
82.
between the two ways of working.
Very much. Dana?
What was it? So it was.
The question was how de Kooning thought about the relationship between the figure and the background, the landscape, both in figurative paintings, but also in more abstract.
I think it's interesting how they do read in this kind, like the figure's always being lost. It's like he's always trying to grasp the figure, so it always kind of becomes into the ground, and then the whole painting kind of comes back up, or in parts of it. But this show, and they're always kind of vertical, and I think that's why the one on the paper is really interesting, because it kind of feels not. This is the Montauk one, because it feels not not as tense maybe as what I usually think of with de Kooning. It always kind of feels like it's almost sliding off, or relaxing, or undulating, like sort of sliding down to the right. But I think that's such a and maybe that's why I think that they read in this way, where they're always kind of very frontal parallel, like how the background and the figure kind of change places and become one. But this show is so varied and incredible, like seeing how it works in so many different paintings, like looking at this painting, and it feels like she is the chair, or she's so kind of in the square of the canvas, and such a portrait. And her lap is like this giant expanse or valley, but then this feels almost like a wild landscape, like almost like El Greco or something like that. Yeah.
And we're going to wrap up soon, but I have a couple more questions, and one with you, Dana, about sculpture, because of course the exhibition features two amazing sculptures. De Kooning was best known for paintings, but also experimented with sculptures starting in the late 60s when he spent time in Rome. He made these little figures that eventually, some of them were enlarged to monumental scale, and we have Standing Woman from 1984 in the middle of the second room of the gallery. So I know that you have been also experimenting with incredible sculptures. There is just one across the street at the Wiener Gallery that can be seen from the window. So I'm curious to hear you talk about your transition from painting to sculpture and what a sculpture allows you to do that painting doesn't.
It's been amazing I just started making sculpture about 6 years ago, and it was really this question of like, I didn't know how to begin, and my husband is a sculptor, and for the longest time I had wanted to make sculpture, and he just said, well, why don't you just make an armature and then just use clay, because like it's really cheap, but if it doesn't work, we can just knock it all down. And it was amazing because it's so responsive, and it's not like painting because there's no mess. It's all, I mean, it is a mess. The whole thing is just this gooey pile. But like, the thing that I really loved about it was that the form could change so easily. And with painting, I would always be really aware of the format of the canvas, and then the figure would be sort of structured within this format. But with making sculpture, it would kind of grow out, and I think that really changed how I was painting, because I was thinking of the forms could kind of come in and out of the space, or they could billow out if you keep building onto them. And it's interesting with de Kooning, because I heard that with the smaller sculptures, he made them with his eyes closed.
In the beginning, they were quite small, and then were enlarged.
And then, is it true? I heard that he was had his eyes closed when he was making them. But I think it's just such a fantastic idea, like this, or just this fantastic, at least, way of thinking about art, or with something that's made from touch instead of something that's made from vision. But it's sort of like this kind of blindness to build the form. And so I was very influenced by de Kooning, but I think that it has that feeling when you're making the sculpture, because you're so immersed in it. It's all one color. It's, you know.
And John and Jenny, what do you think about sculptures
of
de Kooning?
I think his paintings in 3 dimensions, aren't they? As yours are. And I think they relate strongly to his drawings. Which he also sometimes did with his eyes closed, right?
Yeah, in front of the TV.
Yeah.
Yes, the drawings. Yes.
But there's something. They're on the move too. And especially when you see them in bronze, that's such a contradiction, because it's such a hard substance and it's kind of arty, and you see this. And I know the clam digger, they were not super well received when he first showed them, but they've sort of grown in importance.
Yeah, of course.
And I mean, you can feel his hand, or that big leather glove that he wore. That at work, you can feel that, you're aware of that, and which becomes another arm actually, which I didn't really realize when you see it like that. Yeah.
You can really see the artist and the touch of the hands and how he seem to enjoy,
Yeah, really enjoy.
Play and
it's an important sort of move for him, and I think it probably really helped his painting too, to have made that in 3 dimensions and paint at the same time.
Sure.
I think that must have fed both ways.
John?
I'm afraid. I mean, I'm married to a sculptor. I found out long ago I don't have any talent.
Okay.
So,
have you tried?
It's like, dad dancing or something like that when I try to make a sculpture.
And I just have one last question, which you touched upon just early on, but I would like to conclude on that. The Kooning office struggled to declare a painting finished, concluded, and done. There are lots of stories about friends and art critics visiting the studio to kind of rescue the painting from his hands, because otherwise he would have worked on them for weeks and months and sometimes years, as we know from Woman One. There is a famous interview with David Sylvester in which he asked de Kooning, so how do you know when a painting is done? And he says, I just struggle with that, I just stop. And that just stop has been sort of also very inspirational in the way I put this show together, but to me it's not just a declaration of indecision, but it's actually sort of a manifesto for its love for painting, like not wanting to let go of that painting. So I'm curious to hear you talk about that, and also if you, in your own practice, struggle with where to begin a painting and where to finish it.
I think, because he said somewhere where he leaves paintings open, and I've learned a lot from that. If you get an area of a painting that looks really good, but the whole painting's not working, I often leave a painting at that stage for a while, because I don't know how to find the solution to get the next bit. And if I keep going only on one painting at that time, it can get conventional.
Sure.
Because you go back to a sort of a technique, a more conventional technique to find the solution, and you can cover up a lot of paint that was very interesting. So I often put a painting aside at that moment, and then when I'm working on another painting, I kind of glance at it and realize that section of that painting is really good. How can I work around that to make that whole, say it's a portrait, for example, how can I build the side of that face but leave that area at the side of the nose, because that's very exciting, the way the paint works in that area. And you know, looking at de Kooning's studio, where he has a lot of paintings that are activated,
Sure.
he keeps everything on the move, and I've learnt a lot from looking at that.
John?
I've had paintings where something turns out beautiful, and then you, let's say it's a painting of two women, like the one woman turns out beautiful, and then you do the second one, and she's beautiful, but the first one doesn't, you know, and then you do this whack-a-mole thing where in some cases, in my case, it could go on for like 6 years of making, you know, 13 different paintings basically on the same canvas. So I think it's very important.
I think it's as well,
to know when to put it away.
You do it until it stops annoying you. Because there's always an area where you go, that doesn't work, that
Generally,
works quite well.
you do need to let the part that's disappointed you just got to let it move out of the house kind of thing, and you just have to let it be, and realize I can't, you have to accept that there's always a weak part of the painting, and that's just the way it is.
Dana?
I think it feels really itchy. Like, you know, you'll be looking at the paint. In the beginning, everything is wide open and anything can happen, and then at the end, it's like this millimeter idiot thing where you're just kind of like, oh, should it go this way, that way, this way, that way? And then and then when it's finally done, it disappears. Like, you just don't see it. It stops. You can't feel it anymore. It doesn't bother you.
Right, and you come back to it a year later and you think,
you're like, why did I care about this? This is so stupid.
It did not matter.
Right, yeah. But it's really, you know, because the whole painting is this logic that kind of builds to that point. I mean, just formally, like, it, you know, it matters.
Yeah, you're like this maniac.
Yeah, like
Mary Tyler Moore, like not letting your son, you know,
I think there's a moment as well where it gets, the painting has a nature of itself. When I feel like, okay, I'm kind of getting in the right field. If you were going on a walk, sure. that it has, it's embodied, right? So a lot of the, you know, because there's areas that can be super suggestive. I think. And the more you do it, the more you realize, okay, I can let that area live. But if it's got, I think as well that's partly why de Kooning might have worked on paper, because if you work on a kind of precious canvas that you've made, you can be a bit more well-behaved. When you work on paper or something less precious, you're much more playful and you don't mind making mistakes, and I think that interchange of doing that helps you develop the painting technique a lot, because you're not so uptight to get it right. And I think I learned that.
That's what you do as well? Do you work on paper a lot?
Yeah, I have had periods where I've worked more on paper, or I've tried to work on multiple canvases, so I get a few to a certain level, and then leave them for a while and work out how can I take that next step that's not such an obvious step. I mean, you know, if you're building form, there are certain steps you've got to go through to make, if you want it to look sort of in three-dimensional space and have structure and form that you build out, and that has a rational move through it. But to make that an exciting move as well, can take some time to work that out.
I would add that, I hate to admit it, but I think you also have to overcome the fear of making a bad painting. And you have to accept that some of your paintings are going to be bad.
Do you have any regrets of
yeah,
putting
constantly.
out in the world lots of...
But you have to like let them be bad paintings sometimes, and just let them be.
Yeah.
And I have found that making a group of bad paintings is a little bit like a good investment or something like that. It's like buying early or something, and it tends to pay off later. But overcoming a big part of not being able to finish a painting is the fear of it being bad, and so you have to accept. I say that one has to accept. I have a great deal of difficulty doing that, but I think that's a big part of finishing a painting is getting in the habit of just accepting when something is bad, you know.
I think this is a great way of ending this conversation. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you for coming.